We're the first generation to feel the impact of climate change, and the last generation that can do something about it. That quote from former President Obama really sets the stage for our deep dive today. We're going to be taking a hard look at fossil fuel emissions, and more specifically, the companies behind them.
It's a critical topic, especially when you consider that a surprisingly small number of companies are responsible for a huge chunk of global emissions.
Exactly. It's like finding the puppet masters behind the curtain, except in this case, the puppets are carbon emissions, and the stage is our planet.
A rather dramatic analogy, but it drives the point home. So where do we begin unraveling this complex web?
Well, the first thing you need to know is that a mere 36 companies are responsible for half of the world's climate-heating carbon emissions. Let that sink in for a moment. 36 companies. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it?
It is shocking, but it also presents a unique opportunity. If we can influence the actions of these key players, the impact on global emissions could be massive.
That's a great point. It's not just about pointing fingers. It's about identifying leverage points for change. To put this into perspective, imagine Saudi Aramco, the oil giant, as a country. It would be the fourth largest emitter in the world.
That really highlights the scale of these companies' operations and their influence on the global emissions landscape. It's almost like they operate as nation-states in their own right.
It's a fascinating dynamic, and it raises a lot of questions about accountability and responsibility. Now, let's not forget companies like ExxonMobil. Their emissions are on par with Germany, a major industrialized nation.
So we're talking about corporate entities with emissions rivaling entire countries. Where does all this information come from? Is there a reliable source for this data?
Absolutely. It all comes from a report called Top Emitters, Fossil Fuel Companies and Global Emissions. It's updated every year and has become a crucial resource for researchers, activists, and even legal experts.
That's impressive. It shows that this research is more than just academic. It's having a real-world impact. Is this report publicly available?
Yes, it is. And we'll be sure to link to it in the show notes so you can explore it yourself. It really allows you to connect the dots between these major emitters and their impact on a global scale. Now, we won't list all 36 companies here, but let's highlight a few key players. At the top, we have the state-owned giants, Saudi Aramco, Coal India, and CHN Energy from China.
And on the investor-owned side, are there any familiar names there?
You bet. That's where you find companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Shell. What I find interesting is the sheer dominance of Chinese companies in this list, which reflects their massive industrial growth and reliance on coal.
Speaking of coal, the report also breaks down emissions by fuel type, doesn't it? Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. The breakdown is as follows: 41% from coal, 32% oil, 23% gas, and even 4% from cement production.
That's a pretty stark picture of where the majority of emissions are coming from. It also highlights the challenge we face in transitioning away from fossil fuels, especially coal, which still dominates the energy mix in many parts of the world.
It certainly does, and it brings us to a critical question. Given the urgency of the climate crisis, what does this concentration of emissions mean for our global goals? Remember, we need to cut global emissions by 45% by 2030 to have a chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
That target is crucial for avoiding the worst effects of climate change, and yet global emissions are still rising.
Exactly. And the International Energy Agency has issued a stark warning. Any new fossil fuel projects started after 2021 are incompatible with reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero, by the way, means that any remaining emissions are balanced out by removing an equivalent amount from the atmosphere.
It's a critical concept for understanding the path to a sustainable future, but it seems like we are moving in the wrong direction. Are these companies aware of the impact they're having, and what are they doing to address it?
That's a great question, and the report delves into that as well. Unfortunately, it paints a somewhat concerning picture. Most of these companies actually increased their emissions in 2023, which was the hottest year on record at the time.
That is incredibly concerning. Do we have any insights into why these companies continue to increase production, despite the clear warnings from scientists and international organizations?
Well, some experts argue that it's a classic case of short-term profit over long-term sustainability. Emmett Conair from InfluenceMap, the think tank behind the report, stated, despite global climate commitments, a small group of the world's largest fossil fuel producers are significantly increasing production and emissions.
It's almost as if they're deliberately ignoring the warnings. Their actions seem to contradict the global consensus on the need to reduce emissions.
It certainly raises questions about their commitment to a sustainable future. But the good news is this report isn't just highlighting the problem, it's sparking action.
That's encouraging. So this information is not just for awareness, it's a tool for change. Can you give us some examples of how this report is being used to drive action?
Absolutely. For one, it's being used in legal battles against these companies, supporting potential criminal charges against executives, and it's even influencing regulations.
That's great to hear. It shows that this information can be a powerful lever for holding these companies accountable and pushing for systemic change.
Exactly. And that's where you come in. This knowledge is power. It can inform your choices as a consumer, an investor, and a citizen. You can use this information to hold these companies accountable and support the transition to a more sustainable future. But before we dive deeper into that, let's take a quick break. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the topics that matter. And let us know in the comments what surprises you the most about this information. We'll be back in a moment to continue our exploration.
So how can we use this information to make a difference? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the issue.
I hear ya. It can be daunting, but remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about where these emissions are coming from, the better equipped we are to make informed choices.
That makes sense. So what are some practical steps we can take as individuals?
Well, for starters, we can be conscious consumers. Knowing which companies are the biggest emitters can influence our purchasing decisions. Do we really need that product from a company that's actively contributing to the climate crisis? Or are there sustainable alternatives from companies committed to reducing their emissions?
It's about voting with our wallets, right? Supporting businesses that align with our values and pushing the market towards more sustainable practices.
Exactly. And it's not just about what we buy, it's also about where we invest our money. We can choose to support companies that prioritize renewable energy and sustainable practices.
That's a powerful way to influence corporate behavior. By shifting investments away from fossil fuel companies and towards sustainable alternatives, we can send a clear signal that the market is demanding change.
Absolutely. And remember, the Carbon Majors dataset we mentioned earlier is publicly available. You can explore it yourself and see the specific companies impacting your region. It's a great way to understand the problem on a more local level.
I love that this information is so accessible. It empowers individuals to take action and hold these companies accountable. But what about solutions beyond individual actions? What can we do collectively to drive systemic change?
That's a crucial question. And the report does highlight some potential solutions. For example, it discusses the growing movement for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. This treaty would aim to phase out fossil fuel production globally, much like the treaty that banned nuclear weapons.
That's a bold idea. It would require international cooperation and a significant shift in global energy policies. But if successful, it could have a profound impact on reducing emissions.
It certainly would. And the report also highlights the role of governments in driving this transition. They have the power to implement policies that support renewable energy, invest in clean technologies, and hold fossil fuel companies accountable for their emissions.
So it's not just about individual actions, it's about pushing for policy changes that create a more sustainable future.
Exactly. And speaking of historical emissions, let's shift our focus for a moment. Remember how we mentioned that a small group of companies is responsible for a majority of global emissions?
Yes, it's mind-boggling how much influence these companies have had on the climate.
Well, the report takes it a step further and looks at historical emissions dating back to the Industrial Revolution. And get this, 2/3 of all carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution come from just 180 companies.
That is a staggering statistic. It really underscores the long-term consequences of fossil fuel production and the responsibility these companies bear for the climate crisis we face today.
It does, and it raises important questions about accountability and legacy. It's not just about what these companies are doing today, but also about the historical emissions they've released into the atmosphere, emissions that continue to warm the planet.
It's almost like a carbon debt that's been accumulating for generations. And it's a debt that we and future generations will have to pay.
Exactly. And to make it even more thought-provoking, 11 of those 180 companies no longer even exist. But their legacy of emissions lives on. We're still dealing with the consequences of their actions decades, even centuries later.
That's a sobering thought. It highlights the need for a long-term perspective when it comes to climate change. The decisions we make today will have repercussions for generations to come.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just stewards of the present, but also custodians of the future. The choices we make today will determine the kind of world we leave behind for our children and grandchildren.
So while it's important to focus on the present and what we can do to reduce emissions now, We also need to consider the historical context and the legacy we are creating.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the question of responsibility. If a relatively small number of companies are responsible for the majority of emissions, where does that leave the responsibility for addressing climate change? Is it solely on their shoulders? Or do governments, individuals, and other stakeholders share that responsibility?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that requires careful consideration and nuanced answers. We can't simply point fingers and place blame. We need to understand the complexities of the issue and work together to find solutions.
I agree. It's not about pointing fingers, but about recognizing that we are all part of this interconnected system. Our actions or inactions have consequences, and we all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable future.
I think that's a great point to emphasize. It's not just about individual actions or corporate responsibility, it's about collective action and systemic change.
Exactly. We need a multifaceted approach that addresses the issue from all angles.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier. The report also highlighted a call to action from Kumi Naidoo, the president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. Naidu's statement in the report was quite powerful. He said, and I quote, "We are living at a critical moment in human history. It is essential that governments step up and use their authority to end the root cause of the crisis we find ourselves in, the expansion of fossil fuels."
That's a bold statement, but it carries a lot of weight coming from someone like Naidu, who has a long history of environmental activism.
He's basically saying that we need a global effort to tackle this global crisis. We can't rely solely on individual actions or market forces. We need strong policies and international cooperation to phase out fossil fuels and transition to a more sustainable future.
I completely agree. It's a call for collective action on a global scale. And it highlights the urgency of the situation. We are at a crossroads, and the choices we make today will determine the future of our planet. So how do we move forward from here? What are some practical steps we can take to create a more sustainable future?
That's the big question, isn't it? Yeah. And honestly, there's no single magic bullet. But I think the first step is awareness, exactly what we're doing here today. Understanding the scale of the problem, who the major players are, and how our own choices connect to this global system.
I completely agree. Knowledge is power, and this report arms us with the information we need to make informed decisions, both individually and collectively.
Exactly. And beyond awareness, it's about action. We've talked about conscious consumerism, ethical investing, and supporting policies that accelerate the transition to renewable energy. But it's also about holding these companies accountable through legal action, shareholder activism, and public pressure.
It's a multi-pronged approach, and every action, no matter how small, contributes to the larger movement for change.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. We all have different levels of influence and resources, but we can all make a difference. Even something as simple as talking about this issue with your friends and family can raise awareness and inspire action.
Absolutely. It's about starting conversations, challenging assumptions, and encouraging others to think critically about the choices they make. Collective action starts with individual awareness.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought. Remember that staggering statistic about two-thirds of all carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, coming from just 180 companies.
Yes, it really puts the scale of the problem into perspective.
Well, here's the question I want you to ponder. What does that tell us about where the responsibility for climate change truly lies? Is it solely on the shoulders of these companies? Or do governments, individuals, and other stakeholders share that responsibility?
That's a profound question, and one that deserves careful consideration. It challenges us to think beyond simplistic answers and consider the complex web of relationships, policies, and choices that have contributed to the climate crisis.
It does. And ultimately, I think it highlights the need for shared responsibility and collective action. We can't afford to wait for someone else to solve this problem. We all need to step up and be part of the solution.
I couldn't agree more. It's a call to action for all of us, regardless of our background, resources, or level of influence. Every action counts.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, empowering you with the knowledge and insights you need to engage with these complex issues and be a force for positive change. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of fossil fuel emissions and the companies behind them.
It's been a thought-provoking and insightful exploration. I hope our listeners are leaving with a better understanding of the challenges we face and the potential solutions we can pursue together.
I hope so too. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Be sure to leave a comment sharing your biggest takeaway from this episode, what surprised you, What inspired you? And what actions are you going to take? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the topics that matter. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.